Welcome everyone to our webinar, the IAQM Webinar, Air Quality Futures, Environment Agency Horizon Scanning. As part of its ongoing Horizon Scanning programme, the Environment Agency commissioned two projects from leading consultancies. The first, led by Aether, looked at the drivers and changes likely to impact on the agency's work over the coming decades. The second was a joint project between air quality consultants and CERC assessed the developing approaches and technologies around modelling and monitoring. The prospects for integrating these. Today's webinar will represent the findings from these two projects in the context of the agency's wider programme of Horizon Scanning and Innovation. Today, we are joined by Pippa Douglas and Vera Barbosa from the Environment Agency, Francis Marshall from AQC, Jenny Stoker from CERC, and Richard Claxton from Aether. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A function at any point during the presentation, and I will ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you to everyone logging in today.
Thanks, Derek. Vera will provide more background to the project shortly, but first, for some context, I wanted to briefly talk about the Environment Agency's responsibilities and the role of Chief Scientist Group and the air quality work within the Environment Agency more broadly. So the Environment Agency is responsible for protecting and enhancing the environment, and we help people and wildlife adapt to climate change and reduce its impacts. We improve the quality of our water, land and air by tackling pollution, and we work as part of the DEFRA group to create a better place for people and wildlife. Next slide, please. So we work, this work was conducted within the Environment Agency's Chief Scientist Group. So here we lead on science, research, analysis and evaluation for the Environment Agency, which includes the development of novel technologies. And we work closely with others across the agency to identify the evidence needed to inform different business decisions. And we identify gaps in the evidence, we source evidence, and we translate and communicate the evidence to provide confidence in the decisions that we make. Next slide, please. So air quality is a major aspect of our environment and of course can impact both human and ecological health and affects climate change as well. So we're responsible for regulating major industry and waste, which are some of the biggest contributors to air pollution. And therefore, we permit these industries and processes to prevent, or where that's not possible, minimise these emissions to protect human health. In partnership with DEFRA, we operate air quality monitoring networks across the UK, and we also have an emergency resilience and response capacity as we respond in collaboration with our other partners to major air quality incidents. We need to ensure that the tools that we're using to measure and estimate air quality remain up to date and fit for purpose. And we also need to ensure this in an ever-changing climate. As new industries and new technologies develop, the nature and composition of air quality in the UK is going to change over time. So we need to try and be ahead of the curve and have that foresight of how this may change in the future, particularly with the introduction of net zero technologies. So now I'm going to hand over to Vera, who's going to talk about the background to the work. So next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Pippa. Okay, so to help us do all that Pippa just mentioned, so in October 2022, we commissioned two projects under the DEFRA Research, Development and Evidence Framework, which is RDE in short. And this was to identify, prioritize specific needs, opportunities, and challenges surrounding two key questions. So the first one is, how can we best measure, monitor, and model air quality and its drivers for regulated processes and beyond? And second, what are the key drivers and changes of air quality and how they interact with other issues such as inequality? So we aimed to address question one in project one, which focus on monitoring, modeling, and integration of these, and question two in project two, which focused on the drivers of future changes of air quality both of which had a focus on sources and situations relevant to the EA's remit. And we'll go through each one in turn, starting with the monitoring, modeling, and integration, or MMI in short. And I will now hand you over to Francis from AQC, and she'll talk you through the specific objectives, the methods, and the outcome of that project. Thank you.
Thanks, Vera. Next slide, please, Derek. So the overarching aim of the project was, as Vera mentioned, to carry out a review of monitoring, modelling, and their methods of integration, with a specific focus on ambient air quality and bearing in mind the EA's roles and responsibilities that Pippa and Vera have just touched upon. This main aim was broken down into these 6 specific objectives. So the first one involved an element of consolidating the tools and techniques that are currently available to the agency based on their existing requirements. And as part of the forecasting side of things, identifying what tools and techniques could be suitable to address any needs that might arise in the future. And this is where the parallels with the EA's other project comes in. To ensure that the EA is suitably equipped to address these current and future needs, we also needed to identify whether there are any limitations and also whether there are any monitoring, modelling, or integration methods that are currently under development or soon to become mainstream that might be of value to the EA in light of the evolving air quality field, or that have the potential to improve assessment approaches. As Pippa also mentioned earlier, the EA are responsible for operating some monitoring networks, and therefore there was also an objective to around design and implementation of the networks. And finally, as part of reviewing whether any further investment or research was needed into any of the techniques to ensure that they're suitable for use by the agency, we needed to review their state of readiness. Next slide, please. So there were 4 key tasks associated with the project. The first involved investigating the EA's roles and responsibilities via a series of discussions with members of the EA to ensure that we fully understood their remit, any of their concerns and views on the evolving air quality field and how this might affect them as a body. After these initial discussions, we conducted a series of workshops and discussions with a number of experts at the forefront of the monitoring and modelling fields. And this enabled us to draw out a number of key themes, methods, and emerging areas, and develop a comprehensive list of methods that might be of interest to the EA. We then held a meeting with the Environment Agency Steering Group as part of Task 3, during which this comprehensive list was discussed and whittled down to a slightly shorter list, which was then progressed to the final task, which involved a high-level literature review into each method. Next slide, please. So this slide sets out the comprehensive list of methods that were identified as part of the workshops and discussions. As you can see, the monitoring methods encompass a range of types, resource requirements, and network size, whilst the modelling methods encompass different approaches, as well as specific model features. As part of Task 3, some of the methods were discounted, as you can see in the Covered Elsewhere box. And this was either because they're subject to their own comprehensive reviews elsewhere, or were not considered suitable in light of the EA's roles and responsibilities. That being said, the report that will be issued does include a short summary of these methods. So as part of the literature review, we reviewed the current status and its relevance to the EA. We also considered whether any of the methods needed more explanation or guidance to ensure that it's fit for purpose, identified any limitations and possible improvements. And in the case of the monitoring methods, we also provided an overview of uncertainty associated with the technique. Next slide, please. So The review into each method's current status was divided into 3 categories. So state of readiness, usage, and level of expertise required to operate or use the method. In terms of the state of readiness, methods were classified as readily available if they didn't, or if we didn't feel they needed any further research or guidance for the EA to adopt the method for assessments. It was described as prototype if it was still undergoing field testing or required some further guidance to ensure it was appropriately implemented, or research if it was fairly novel and still under development. For usage, this was based on how many examples in the literature of its application we could find. So a method was described as well established if there were numerous citations in the literature. But if we could only find limited applications or examples, or the experts told us so, then this was stated as only having a few applications. The level of expertise related to how much experience was required to apply the methods. So, for example, if a member of the public could use the method, it was classed as low, whereas if it required, it was deemed as high if it required an air quality practitioner or someone with experience to apply the method. Should point out that whilst the method might be described as low, doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's correctly applied by a non-specialist. Next slide, please. So as part of the report, we provided a table that also categorized each method according to its relevance to the agency. As Pippa and Vera highlighted earlier, one of the EA's roles involves regulating permitted processes, and therefore it was also important to establish whether or not the method could be used for assessing against air quality metrics. One such example from the report being CFD, which is based on a subset of MET conditions and therefore can't be used to calculate annual averages. Similarly, there are certain monitoring techniques that might be suitable, but only if the equipment has been robustly validated and tested. In terms of looking ahead to future areas that the agency may need to regulate, in some instances, the suitability of the methods will depend on the nature of what is needed, what they're needing to regulate. So the new industrial activity or the fuel type, and therefore at this stage it's difficult, or it was difficult to assign relevance. There are also some methods that were identified as part of the shortlist that relate to model features rather than a specific method, and therefore it can't be used in isolation. And also some methods just weren't applicable to some of the EA's roles and responsibilities. And so where this was the case, it was highlighted in the table. Next slide, please. So during our initial discussions with the agency as part of Task 1, there were 6 topics that emerged as areas that the EA had particular interest in. So we used these 6 case studies to contextualize the methods and see how they might be applied to address each of these topics. So the topics included, as set out on the slide, ammonia and NOx from combustion, the latter in the context of combustion from new fuels such as hydrogen that might be more prevalent in the future. Exposure to mixtures of pollutants over prolonged periods, intensive farming, industrial clusters, and also built environments. And Jenny is going to discuss 2 of these case studies in a bit more detail over the next couple of slides. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Frances. So starting with intensive farming of both crops and livestock refers to maximising agricultural production on a given area of land. This type of farming is increasingly necessary due to population increases. A range of emissions are generated from intensive farming. Quantifying ammonia emissions is important for habitats in terms of nitrogen deposition, but also from a human health perspective in terms of contributing to the generation of particulate matter. Intensive farming also generates emissions of primary particulates, bioaerosols, and methane. Both static and mobile monitoring are options for assessing air pollution near intensive farms. Monitors can record hourly concentrations, but passive samplers are also an option, for example, when assessing ammonia. Standard modelling approaches that allow for the influence of buildings on pollutant releases can be used, for example, using Gaussian plume and CFD models. There are challenges, however, for example, when trying to quantify the relationship between animal growth cycles and emissions. Source terms are also particularly difficult to define when assessing bioaerosols, and there are added complications because of the physical processes that take place, for example, coagulation. Next slide, please. Industrial clusters are geographic regions that consist of several similar or different industries. The government's current industrial strategy is to create a net zero carbon industrial cluster by 2040 and at least one low carbon cluster by 2030. Current industrial clusters in the UK include Grangemouth, Humberside, Merseyside, and South Wales. Industrial clusters emit a range of pollutants, and new processes have the potential to emit substances we haven't previously considered in our air quality assessments. For example, amines are released from some carbon capture, utilization, and storage processes, and their atmospheric degradation products, nitramines and nitrosamines, are potentially harmful. In such complex environments, an integrated approach involving monitoring and modelling may be the best way to assess air pollution impacts. For example, a preliminary assessment using a simple model setup combined with the deployment of some low-cost sensors would predict the likely impacts of the cluster, certainly in terms of the spatial location of the highest concentrations. This could then inform the deployment of a hierarchical monitoring network, which includes some reference quality measurements in areas of likely high concentrations. More refined modelling would be evaluated using measurements from these more accurate monitors. Obviously, such an approach would be costly and would require good communication between all industrial site operators, but the investment can be justified because some of these industrial clusters are near to populated areas. From a modelling perspective, it is important to take account of the complex chemical processes and also ensure that all releases have representative dispersion parameters such as stack height and efflux data. This information could be held in a regularly updated database that covers the whole site. Next slide, please. I'm now going to summarise our main findings in relation to the differing assessment methods. Many monitoring methods are suitable for a range of pollutants. The different methods have varying temporal resolutions, spatial coverages, and purchase costs. All methods have their own inherent uncertainty, and the methods require careful consideration to make sure that the technique is fit for purpose. The rise in low-cost sensors could potentially expand geographical air quality monitor coverage, but many people have highlighted the importance of equipment certification and also for guidance in relation to monitoring device application. Models are available that can represent processes at small and large temporal and spatial scales, and joining one model with another or with measurements also allows a range of scales to be accounted for. Models have the potential to be developed to assess the impact of new activities and fuels. It is the responsibility of model developers to verify that the underlying model formulations are correct, but model users are responsible for correct model application, i.e., if you don't set your model up with the correct inputs, then the model outputs won't be any good. Model users should be encouraged to compare outputs with measurements where possible and provide explanations for model results. Measurements are often used as model input and for calibration and boundary conditions. In general, the more complex methods for integrating modeling and monitoring are not widely available for standard air quality assessments. It is interesting, however, that some integration techniques, such as data assimilation and machine learning, are well established in other fields. It may be that we could learn from experts outside the field of air quality. Next slide, please. So in terms of future work, when it comes to guidance, modelling and monitoring documents exist that have been written for different groups, committees and users. Consolidating these documents with those from the Environment Agency and DEFRA would streamline air quality assessments. Also, we have highlighted several areas where additional guidance for the community may be beneficial to ensure methods are applied correctly. We have suggested that a coordinated approach to air quality assessments of common, complex situations, such as industrial clusters, could be made easier if protocols were established, including preparing guidance and creating steering groups. Extensions to some national monitoring networks, such as the National Ammonia Monitoring Network, could help with documenting air quality in areas that are currently sparsely covered, including coastal regions. There is also the potential to complement existing monitoring networks with alternative technologies as new devices become certified. Lower accuracy monitors may be used to map the state of pollutants across large geographical areas to help with targeted placement of higher accuracy monitors. The report summarizes the current state of air quality monitoring and modeling tools, but it is important to remember that this is a snapshot. Assessment techniques develop over time, so guidance documents must be updated to reflect current tool capabilities. The Environment Agency and other regulatory bodies have a catalogue of monitoring data, which could be a valuable resource for the research community, particularly with respect to cumulative pollutant exposure and potential compliance issues. The air quality community may benefit from being given access to a reference database containing these data sets. Emissions databases need to be regularly reviewed to ensure that the inputs to air quality models are as accurate as possible. This is particularly important in terms of new pollution sources and fuels, which I think is a good starting point for the Drivers and Changes project. So over to Richard.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So at Aether, we took a lead on this parallel task, which was running alongside the MMI project. And we were looking more broadly then at the drivers of future changes. So quite a wide remit, actually, into coming up with potential ideas of topics of interest or that may become more of interest in the future, particularly for the Environment Agency. So next slide, please. So as a bit of introduction to this task then, we really wanted to look into the general outlook for what changes we could expect going forward in terms of air quality within England, giving particular attention then to those topics that are within the scope of the Environment Agency's regulatory jurisdiction. Some examples of that could be new sources that we expect to broadly increase local emissions or change the setup or makeup of local emissions and concentrations around particular sources or activities. But then we also wanted to account for the fact that just as the landscape changes, perhaps other sources, more existing sources continue to decline, then the priorities and the outlook for the Environment Agency may change as a result of that, focusing on newer or potentially smaller localized sources compared to what they've been focusing on previously. So then we wanted to make sure that we identify research requirements for the priority topics, and just by building an evidence base and understanding which topics do and do not have current kind of research and depth of research behind them, then we can start to provide some advice on research gaps and knowledge areas that we would recommend and highlight for the Environment Agency to consider going forward. And all of this really is under the context of air quality. We're focusing on impacts to air, but we know that there are links then with a number of these topics to water, land, climate, net zero. So we've kept that in mind, but really focusing on the impacts to air quality as a starting point in this piece of research. Next slide, please. So our approach, some similarities with the MMI project. So our task one was to do quite a high-level review, a bit of a literature search, definitely not a full literature review at that stage, but also then consulting with our existing network with the Environment Agency and other partners of UK experts to get and consult on what we think likely topics of interest are. So I'll come on to that in a minute, at what the long list looked like, but putting together quite a long list of potential future drivers and changes of air quality. Task two then, which is covered in more depth in the next slide, was our approach to prioritizing those topics and identifying a priority list that we could take forward for further review. Task three was to finalise a short list of topics, which we did working with the EA Steering Committee, and again then taking our initial insights and expert advice, but then consulting to make sure that the topics that were listed for further review aligned with the Environment Agency's priorities, and that we had a good spread of different topics, and I'll outline a little bit more in later slides about how we did that. Then the final task was to actually conduct a more focused evidence review of the shortlisted topics. Next slide, please. So wanted to just introduce then how we went about defining a priority list. So really we came up with, in the end, it was around 42 topics that made it onto our long list, and I'll show you in the next slide a little example of what that looks like. But in order then to turn that down into a more focused list that we could look at in more depth, we wanted to provide some traceability and some kind of quantitative way of priority scoring the long list that we came up with. So this is by no means perfect, but it provided us with an initial list that could then go in to those discussions with the EA Steering Committee and give us a bit more of a grounded base for discussion. So we really wanted to highlight then topics that were relevant to the Environment Agency's remit. Of course, there will be some things that are emerging that don't yet have that EA remit well understood. It may be that that comes in the future, but we could provide an indication of whether we thought it was likely to come under the Environment Agency's remit in future for those new sources or newer sources. We wanted to promote sources that we thought could have an impact in the short to medium term, those that potentially have a high impact in terms of emissions and localized concentrations. But then importantly as well, perhaps highlighting topics that don't yet have that much knowledge in terms of confidence, but that do have a basis and some references, whether that's global. We've looked at particularly some of the US literature for emerging sources. So topics that perhaps don't have as much understanding just yet in terms of the confidence of impact, but that do have a bit of a grounding in research that could be used for future. So this was just a starting point really, and allowed us to put together a prioritized list that we could take into then our discussions with the steering committee. And next slide, please. So this is just an example, a bit of a snapshot of what our long list looked like. So we have a number of topics. As I said, we ended up with 42 in our long list. We broke those down into kind of sectoral clusters. We identified whether they were likely to be, or we considered were quite strongly already linked to the remit of the Environment Agency, and then added in timeframes. We wanted to know whether there were pollutant projections or emission impacts that had already been researched or known. And then that all led up to giving us a priority score, which you can see on the right-hand side. So that enabled us to then take that into our meeting with the EA Steering Committee. And during that meeting then, we actually ended up combining a couple of sources or topics. We made sure that we avoided kind of direct duplication with the MMI project. So there was clearly some crossover between the types of topics that we're dealing with and the monitoring issues that were picked up in the other project. So at that stage, we kind of did a little bit of just harmonizing the list. And then the Environment Agency Committee also wanted to make sure that we included at least one topic from what we've called the sectoral cluster, just to make sure that we're getting a broad range of topics. And also then we just noted that in this long list, we had a number of topics that kind of related to specific species or pollutants. And then there were broader topics that related to air quality across a range of issues or potentially across a range of pollutants. So we wanted to make sure that we had a good balance in our shortlist of topics that did cover some of those more specific issues, but then also covered potentially broader issues that we want to track going forward. Next slide, please. So this is our shortlist. So we ended up with 9 topics typically lined up pretty well with what we'd identified from our scoring under task 2. But then in combination with the steering committee, we came up with these 9 topics. So we had ethylene oxide emissions from typically deriving from medical sterilization processes. We have battery manufacture and disposal. We have deployment of CCS technologies. We have PFOS and PFAS as new species of concern, and with a particular focus for our project then of the airborne impact of those chemicals. We have antimicrobial resistance as a topic and how that influences air quality. We have urban ammonia and the use of ammonia as a fuel. We have bioaerosols. We have NOx from H2 combustion. And then we have cold air drainage of air pollutants by katabatic flow. So a much more localized issue there to do with how katabatic flow influences pollutants. Typically, we focus that around specific landfill sites in England. Next slide, please. So just to give you a taste of then what we did under stage 4, which was to provide a little bit more depth of research, just wanted to give you then the types of information that we've included within the report for each of these shortlisted items. So I've just used battery manufacture and disposal as a topic to talk around as a bit of a summary. So under the theme then, this is one of those topics. There's a little bit more about potentially emerging sources as battery manufacture, larger scale batteries manufacture increases in the UK, largely to fit the needs of moving towards more electrification and electrified vehicles. So why are we concerned about this then? Our description and scope of work really is related to potentially toxic emissions due to these thermal runaway events. So within lithium batteries, when there's internal damage, you can get this slow thermal runaway process, which can lead to combustion, but also just the release of solvent droplets and the release of toxins to the environment. So the pollutants of concern typically then are some of the metals, but then also hydrogen chloride, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen fluoride, and then particles as well. We decided or thought that this was really what we're calling medium term, so kind of near term, but perhaps over a more decadal time frame. There's clear links with this to net zero policy, as we've said, and emergence of electric vehicles and the manufacture that's needed to keep up with that. So whilst a lot of this is potentially moving towards electric vehicles, you know, the Environment Agency remit is much more to do with the battery manufacture, the recycling processes and the disposal routes of the products. And then we started to look into the spatial distribution. So this then aligns with the industrial clusters work that was presented previously, but identifying so far that this is really based in Midlands, the Northwest. There are currently 2 gigafactories under construction, one in Sunderland and one in Blyth. And then of importance will also be the location and distribution of the fire testing labs, recycling facilities, and the landfill locations where the products may be disposed at the end of their lifetime. Next slide, please. In terms of public health then and ecosystems, pretty clear impact, I think, particularly where there's combustion and then a release of potential pollutants and toxins. So potentially locally, we need to understand the health effects of the types of exposure that could be generated. In terms of ecosystems then, yeah, similar, but also then we're thinking about the impact of releases of toxins and sulfants to aquatic ecosystems, and the impact of things like bioaccumulation of toxins in water sources. We look at the mitigation potential. So really here, this is going to be around the testing facilities, the collection and material recovery phases that the Environment Agency could be involved in setting up, regulating and legislating against. And then importantly here as well, we have the potential for illegal disposal of batteries, and the potential impact that that has on kind of fire events is something that we at least highlight as a need for consideration. We comment then on all of these topics on what we consider to be the readiness for research. So we think about the scale, the scope and geographies, in this case of the future production facilities. We identified that there was previous work by the Environment Agency on landfill incidents and landfill fires. Major update was in 2011, I think. So there could be a need to review how that research and that study could be affected by an increase and a change in the production and then end disposal routes of these batteries. And then on a more local basis, understanding what those releases are likely to be and potential for concentration monitoring around specific, potentially those higher risk facilities that are identified. In some of these topics, we talk a little bit about kind of public interest, and there are some of these topics that have been quite heavily featured in news recently as well. So the report touches upon that where it's particularly relevant. I guess just as a slight aside, what we did identify across this is that in some of these more local issues, or where there are concerns locally, the emerging nature of how we consume media means that Facebook groups, local groups, those can be quite important actually in understanding the response of communities or the feeling of communities around kind of new facilities, new industries, new developments. So just a note really that it's not just kind of common media platforms that are useful in some of these cases. Kind of social media can be give a real insight into kind of local feeling about some of these topics. Next slide, please. So just to summarize a little bit then, I think we talked about what our shortlisted topics are and given an example of the type of content that we've then provided in a bit more detail. Broadly, we think that the topics that we've identified fall into 3 boxes, although there's a bit of crossover between them. So we have a number of topics then that are focused more on new or more recent air pollutant processes, and we delve into those in a bit more detail. There are new aspects then of established air pollutants. So we've talked about the use of ammonia as a fuel, for example, and then the changing role of katabatic flows on landfills as well as bioaerosols. And then there are also these new products and disposal routes. So the future looking topics perhaps of hydrogen combustion and battery manufacturing in the UK. So hopefully we've managed to, in this study, provide a good coverage again of those different sectors and different types of issues. The fact that we came up with 42 topics in our long list, I think, shows that there is clearly a lot that we need to consider going forward, but at least this provides a start on hopefully some of those higher priority topics. And I think at this stage, I'll hand back over to Vera and Pippa, and they can pick up on the kind of what comes next part. So thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Richard.
you, Richard. Yeah, I think it's me now, just to let you know that when the reports, they are going to be published online, and you'll be able to access them via the gov.uk website. And we were hoping that the reports would have been available to coincide with this meeting, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. But rest assured that the reports are in the publication pipeline and should be published sometime in November. And we will continue liaising with the IAQM to ensure that you inform when they are published, and then you can access them. Next slide, please. So this is what will happen next. I think Pippa has something to say about that.
Yeah. So of course, these reports have provided some high-level summaries of a variety of key topic areas and practical methods that may be of value to the agency. And they're not intended to be extensive or exhaustive reviews or to provide specific recommendations for future investment, but they do identify air quality research options for us to consider for further research. And we're actually already acting on the outcomes of these projects and either conducting the work ourselves or we're steering the work of others, both within and outside of the Environment Agency. So just to add, I'm not sure how long we've got left, so feel free to cut me short, Derek, but I just wanted to highlight a few that we're currently working on at the minute. So we're conducting a rapid review of evidence relating to the release characteristics, dispersion and depositional properties of airborne PFOA and other PFAS substances. And this work's ongoing. And we hope that this work will be completed by the end of the financial year, so watch this space. And we've got a huge work programme on AMR, and as this is increasingly recognised as having an environmental component, and within that an airborne transmission route from agricultural practices and waste processes. So we're exploring further links with academic and government partners on this important topic, and there's actually a UKRI call out at the moment for AMR network proposals. For bioaerosols, we're participating in and steering the work led by others, including BioAirNet, which is one of the UKRI NEC strategic priority funded clean air networks. And one of the outputs of BioAirNet has been the production of a compendium, which provides a nice comprehensive toolbox of current techniques, workflows and technologies for bioaerosol sampling and characterisation and monitoring. And we've also been involved in many projects involving predictive models to estimate air quality, including one specific to bioaerosols, which is led by the University of Birmingham, and that's officially due to start next month. And that's called the APES project, which stands for Artificial Intelligence for Pollen and Spore Detection, Forecasting and Human Health. And this is aiming to design and test new tools to detect and forecast allergenic and toxic bioaerosols using AI coupled with an Internet of Things approach. There is going to be a stakeholder engagement element to that as well. So happy to put you in touch with the team if that's of interest to anyone on this call. we're looking into katabatic flows. So these involve the downslope movement of cold air that can carry high levels of air pollution from regulated sites to sensitive receptors. So, for example, landfills to the people who live near landfills. And we plan to review the occurrence of these flows using past monitoring data and to investigate how they might be predicted for mitigation or avoidance in the future. We're also providing some air quality expertise and advice to the Environment Agency's climate change team, who are leading some work on environmental constraints related to net zero clusters. With satellites, of course, these can measure plumes of air pollution from large regulated sites with increasing resolution, both in time and in space. And we're planning a project to develop procedures for selecting and analysing satellite images so that the evidence of air pollution is auditable and robust for regulatory needs. And in terms of monitoring networks, the Environment Act and associated regulations have introduced new binding targets for PM2.5 concentrations and reductions in population exposure to them. And these, the low concentrations involved are at the limits of current measurement capability. So we've been working to improve statistical confidence in the information extracted from the measurements and to understand the factors driving uncertainty in measurements with a view of better accounting for them. So that's what we've kind of got in the works at the moment, but we're also planning for the next 3 years. So lots of exciting research to come from us. So next slide, please. So Vera's already covered this. Yeah, unfortunately, we did want the reports to be published to coincide with this event, but unfortunately that's not happened. But again, watch this space. We'll let you know as soon as they're out. Next slide, please. And just a thank you. So I don't know, Vera, did you want to do the thank yous?
Yes. Okay. Just as the project manager from the beginning of the project, I would really like to thank everybody involved. I'm not going to name everybody, but the list is there. The consultant project team from the consultancies. And the Environment Agency wider project team as well, the Environment Agency steering committee, which was really a help in to steer the project and find the topics that really were agree on the topics that really were relevant. And also thank you, the workshop participants, for your interest. And if you have any question, I think there are some questions in the chat already, but you can ask them now as well. Thank you.
Fantastic, everyone. And just to reiterate, obviously the work hasn't been published yet. This webinar has been recorded, but we won't be publishing it until the work has been published. We do have a couple of questions. The first one's quite lengthy, and I know that we're going to break this up into a few different people responding. So the first one is, do you have any research to understand long-range source contribution factor calculation and assessment?
So in the report, in the MMI report, we talk about receptor modelling. So that involves analysis of detailed measurements, for example, from the super sites. And you could use that method for assessing the long-range contribution of different from different sources. There's some US software that helps you do that, and it's also the topic of a fair mode activity. There's documents there. So if you look in the report when it comes out, another method of quantifying the contribution of different sources to long-range pollutant transport is to use chemical transport models. So they can be used. There are different methods. You can use tagging in them or brute force methods to do source apportionment. So that's the first section. The second comment and question, that's the artificial neural networks and machine learning and deep learning techniques. So I think we would agree with you that they have a lot of potential. I don't think that refers to the previous question. I don't think, I'm not sure that you could use those methods to understand long-range pollutant transport sources, but I'm not sure that's what you meant.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. The next question then, for moving on, in relation to the guidance, you talked about consolidation of guidance. For many, monitoring and modelling guidance has focused on road traffic, which has its own challenges compared to industrial sources. Are you thinking consolidation covers all sources or just those critical to EA?
I can chip in a bit here. In terms of consolidating guidance that we raised as part of the MMI report, that was in the context of the EA's remit. So I might defer to the EA as far as in terms of whether it would extend beyond traditional sort of point source modelling that they're more interested in.
Yeah, Rob Kinnersley, who's one of the part of the project team, is with us on the call in disguise as me, probably because I've shared my joining link with him, but I can see he's got his hand up, so hopefully Rob can address that.
Yes, sorry, I was looking at Duncan's question about this is the monitoring and modelling guidance one. Am I in the right place there? And you ask, yes, we are focusing on industrial sources, but we do also have a duty around monitoring air quality nationally. So we look after all of the air quality monitoring networks for the UK. And at the moment, there's a lot of work going on between us and DEFRA to decide which monitors go where. So yeah, there is active research on there. Just looking at the other part of your question, yes, we do consider the importance of metadata for monitoring and modelling. I think you know, for the modelling, it goes without saying. For the monitoring,
sorry, Rob, just in the interest so that everyone that's on the call, I'll just read the question out and just let you answer that part. The question is, for monitoring, modelling guidance, do you consider the importance of metadata for both, including limitations of monitoring the potential benefit roles of local scale wind models?
Sorry, I didn't appreciate, not everyone could see that. Yes is the answer. We do consider metadata. Oh, it's disappeared again. We do consider metadata. Sorry, I'm not quite sure why the question's disappeared from the list. But we if you can make it reappear again, I can put my words to it. Just while you're doing,
it's gone onto the answered tab. If you
okay.
If you click on the answered tab, then it.
Sorry, I'm
it's in the chat as well, so you can see.
The limitations of monitoring the potential beneficial roles of local scale wind models. Yeah, I think we'd much rather be measuring metadata at sites, but we have found that modeling using environmental CFD methods, modeling very local flows, has been important. It's something we've pushed out for ages, and there's a lot of resistance to it. I think just because it's not been done much, and because it's perceived as being complex and difficult. But we've got some really nice case study information now about how easy it is to do CFD modeling of complex flows in built environments. And that's really helping us target both understanding the pollution dispersion and also helping us optimize monitoring where we put the monitors.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. That is it for the questions. Like I say, as soon as we have a notification that the work has been published, we'll let everyone that's attended the webinar know, and this recording will be published on our website. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone, all panelists and those attendees. I hope that you found it beneficial and informative.